My name is Jason, and this is the Hearts of Wulin Kickstarter special episode. Listeners, I am joined by the authors of the game Hearts of Wulin, Agatha Cheng and Lowell Francis. Hi, Agatha. Hi, Lowell.
Hello.
Hey.
And we are invading all of the Gauntlet Network podcast feeds to bring you some information about Hearts of Wulin, which will be hitting Kickstarter very, very soon, probably within a few days of this episode being up.
Woo.
Yeah, so let's start with some basics here. What is Hearts of Wulin? Agatha?
Hearts of Wulin is a PBTA game, so powered by the Apocalypse game of wuxia melodrama. It seeks to replicate that kind of feel where you do sick fights, and you get to describe them, but then you also have really intense feels because of your relationship to each other.
Awesome. Lowell, when we say wuxia melodrama, what are some of the pop culture touchstones that people might be familiar with?
So the one that people always point to is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where we have multiple characters in difficult relationships that can't express their feelings, and the triangles move and shift and so on. And that's probably the biggest pop culture reference, though the original sources are a little bit deeper than that.
Awesome. Before we dive into some of the mechanical considerations of Hearts of Wulin, I want to talk about how the project came together, because I think it's a really interesting story. Lowell, originally, Hearts of Wulin was your idea. This was a couple years ago. You put together a basic playtest material, started playing it. We'll talk about how Agatha came into the picture in a bit, but I'm curious, why was it important for you to make a game about wuxia melodrama, and why did you settle on Powered by the Apocalypse? I'm curious how that came together.
So we had played a homebrew hack using Storyteller system that we had tried, because I had seen a bunch of these Chinese TV dramas. And what happened every session was, rather than the fighting being as important, is all the character stuff and the romance stuff kind of came to the fore in that. We did that, and then it was okay. And then a few years later, I was at Origins, and I was talking with Renee Knipe, and we were talking about doing a PBTA wuxia game, and she was very nice, and I went back home and I wrote up a version of it, and I kind of sent it on to her to look at, and she was very nice and didn't say, "This is hot garbage," which it was, because it was very much highly detailed styles and all of this stuff. And Renee said, and I can't remember how she put this, but she said the romance has always been so much more important for when I've thought about that. I was like, okay. And then I played Monster Hearts, and it killed me. That game, with just a few moves and a few connections, had all of the good emotional weight that I wanted from play. And it was after that Mercy Falls game that I was like, I've got to do something that gets at that.
That's terrific. So you put together these basic playtest materials. People started playing it in the Gauntlet. I was one of the early playtesters. Agatha, you were one of the early playtesters. I'm curious what drew you to the initial material, because you eventually started getting more and more involved in the project. And I'm curious, what was that initial thing that grabbed you?
Yeah, it's funny because I think it was one of the first games that I played with a Gauntlet as well. I started trying to play Gauntlet games, so waitlisting for games.
Right, yeah.
Which is a thing that is a really great way of playing Gauntlet games, just waitlisting for things, and then eventually you'll get in. True story. I saw the description, which is that this is a story of wuxia melodrama, and I think I grew up reading these books that later were adapted into TV shows and movies, and then readapted over and over again because they were so popular. And specifically the ones that I read were written by Jin Yong. And I think it's just that kind of melodrama is ingrained into me as a deep part of entertainment. And I also watch a lot of East Asian dramas, so Taiwanese dramas, Korean dramas, Japanese dramas, especially the historical ones. They have that really heightened level of melodrama in all of their stories, no matter what they're trying to tell. So I just find that very emotionally satisfying. So when I saw it, I was like, I need to be in this game. And yeah, I remember being in that game and then being like, oh, I'm so excited because I don't know anything about the Gauntlet, and I love this style of game, and it was amazing.
Well, it's so great because Hearts of Wulin as a project is really close to my heart personally, not only because Lowell is a good friend and works with me in the Gauntlet, but also because I think that the way you got hooked into Gauntlet stuff, Agatha, is like so great, right? Like you've already mentioned, like you kind of just started joining waitlists for games and you got into some games. I remember you got into one of my Wodu games at one point, and that was kind of how I first met you. And you just stayed involved. And when Lowell and I were having like conversations about where to take Hearts of Wulin next, one of the big considerations was, well, presently this is a project being put together entirely by white people, and in my case, a half-white person, and maybe we should at the very least get some kind of like cultural consulting going on or sensitivity reading, right? That was a priority early in the project, and so we understood your fondness for the genre because you were playing in the games with us, right? Like, and I think that is such a great example of like how we kind of work as a community. And so I kind of it means a lot to me just kind of seeing how it's developed. We of course asked you to come on to do that, but then as the conversations proceeded, like as we got deeper into figuring out like where this was going to go, it became really obvious that you needed to be a co-author, right? I mean, and Lowell made the pitch. Lowell, why was it important for you to get Agatha involved?
When I went to run it for Agatha, that was the second time I'd run it. I'd run it for one other group, and they'd had a good time, and they were excited about it. And so I was very nervous there. Agatha understood the sources. It wasn't just Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. She knew the original story. She knew where this was coming from. Her character right away was right in genre and pushing all of those buttons for what ended up being a seriously tragic story in just a few moments. There's a bit where Fraser, his character, misstates something, and Agatha's character is kind of standing and he overhears it, and there's just the movement of the fan that she has her character do that I was like, oh yeah, that's right. That's exactly what would happen.
Most of what I'll be contributing to this project is a lot of cultural context, both in terms of the context from the literary genre and I suppose also the film aspect. I'll probably get Lowell to do more of that because he's watched more than I have, because a lot of these wuxia stories are also informed by Confucianism and then just his history in general, and that is sometimes harder to emulate without being explicitly stated. So that's a lot of the stuff that I'll be working on.
One of the things is there's so much visually going on in these stories that are historical identifiers that we don't get in the West. We watched House of Flying Daggers, and that's set in the Tang Dynasty. Mm-hmm. That's 800 AD, and the costuming is very different. The weapons are using very different. Everything is different there. And when you watch, you can see that those are all historical markers that we don't see. And they're important because they also provide a context to what's going on more generally. All of the Xinjiang stories have a very specific time that they take place. Not necessarily that they're referencing it, but that there are echoes of what the country's like in those eras.
Yeah.
And I'd love for us to be able to have people go, oh, this is what's going on there. Now I can go back and look at these things and understand better what's going on in these stories.
Or if someone were to say, I want to run this game, but I've never watched a wuxia film before, or I vaguely remember watching Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon years ago, I want to write up something that people can pick up and then say, okay, I think I have a general idea of how to set these stories and things like that.
That's really great. I want to say I've run about 16 sessions of Hearts of Wulin so far, playtest sessions, using different versions of the rules. And I think that the playtest rules that I've used, they're a little more advanced now as of the day of this recording. We just released the new public playtest rules, and they're significantly more detailed than what I was running them off of. But I found that the rules got me about 75% of the way there in terms of what kinds of stories were supposed to be happening. Like, it's kind of baked into the moves, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what I really needed, because I'm not super fluent or conversant in wuxia, what I really needed was that support text, right, to really get me to the finish line of like feeling 100% confident in the game. And so that's a really critical part of it, right? And I think that one thing that role-playing games have always been really great about doing, in my opinion, if they're presented properly, is they give you space to explore a genre that you may not have been familiar with, right? And they give you different types of tools to explore it. And so I increasingly really love it when the support text in the game is not just setting material, but it's also like, this is the genre we're trying to emulate. These are the historical and cultural touchstones we're trying to hit. So I'm super excited. I think it's like a really, really exciting project overall. I think it's going to be so cool. Let's talk about the mechanics of Hearts of Wulin. I think the mechanics do a lot of the work here, and all the sessions I've run have been really, really fun. What are some of the ways that Hearts of Wulin helps emulate the genre? Like, how is that design goal being met?
The first thing was to figure out how to have emotions and connections mean something. And not in a buildup of a resource or tracking or things like that, but that we have a move that is about dealing with that. And Monster Hearts showed me that it could be done. So we have our inner conflict move, which really draws inspiration from Monster Hearts. And it's that essentially when you are confronted with problems from your relationships, which we call entanglements, or other issues involving your background or so on, you have to roll inner conflict to see if you hold yourself together or if you kind of crumble and run away, or if on a miss, things get worse. Like you get confronted with your worst fears about it, the situation changes. Just having that engine, people saw that and they knew what they were doing and they knew that that was going to get hit. And the phrase I use is, do you think that rises to the level of inner conflict? Give the players a chance to assess how deep an emotional moment it is. And sometimes they'll say no. And sometimes they'll say yes, and then they put their fate into the dice's hands.
Yeah, I love it. I'll tell you from playing it, it's a really terrific gameplay loop. The entanglements are there. The GM knows what they are. The GM can introduce NPCs or situations to help like push the inner conflict. The inner conflict roll happens. That usually results in like complications or bad things happening. The characters sometimes literally fleeing the scene because they just can't cope with the turmoil of it. Occasionally they have to mark an element, and an element is like an ability. It's what you use for your rolls. And then that means they have to go have romantic or intimate or connection scenes with other characters to get access to those elements. It's just a really terrific engine of emotion and drama. Agatha, how have you found that to be in the game? Like this sort of the entanglements, the inner conflict, that whole loop.
Yeah, I do really want to talk about entanglements. So entanglements are basically backstories that you choose for your characters. So there's the romantic and the general entanglements, and you choose one of each for your own character, and they're always pointing outwards. They generally point towards one PC and one NPC, and sometimes towards two PCs. And they're always very fraught. I have some of them pulled up. For example, a romantic one is, I love so-and-so, but my family member so-and-so is a legendary villain.
Nice.
So, okay. All right. No biggie. Just the worst thing ever. The way the inner conflict works is whenever a situation can touch on one of your entanglements or just, is inherently very stressful for a PC, then you would be like, hey, how are you feeling? Do you feel conflicted? Which is how I usually cue it. And my favorite thing is actually, in the beginning, I'll cue it a lot. To the point where people are like, wow, Agatha loves it when people are feeling inner conflict. But then later on, they just cue it themselves.
Yep.
When things happen, they're like, I think I need to roll inner conflict.
Yes.
Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. I wasn't even like thinking about inner conflict, and the player will be like, I think this is probably inner conflict. Like they want to get into that emotional turmoil, which I think it's a great effect of the game. Maybe we just have a lot of like play to lose kind of players, I don't know, in the Gauntlet, but my experience has been that people really love to get into trouble. Let's talk about combat a little bit. I know the emphasis of the game is definitely on melodrama and romance and emotion, and that all comes through really, really nicely. I think it's what frankly sets it apart from other games with a similar genre approach or setting that I've seen in role-playing games. But I think combat's really important, and I actually find the combat to be super enjoyable in this game. I would actually love, I've been like nonstop thinking about, how do I take the one roll scale based combat of Hearts of Wulin and basically put it in all my games because I like it a lot. What's your thinking on the combat, Lowell? Like, where'd that come from? And how does it work, of course?
Well, so originally, like when I did my early versions of wuxia games, we had like all of these different phrases and tags and stuff, and you combine them to get these moves, and you had to shout out your thing, and it was like super complicated because I was working with trad systems. And then when my first version of this game had different harm levels and different styles and maybe different kinds of damage and things, I was like, I don't think I want to run that. It was playing masks, which has harm that is kind of tied to your stats with the penalty from that. And then kind of realizing an even easier way would be, okay, it's not a penalty. You just don't get to roll with that stat. And that became a great harm track. And so that required me to go, I want the fights, the duels to be done like fast. We go win or lose, you take a mark of harm. We're not doing damage levels. We're not doing any kind of tracking on that. We're going to do them fast. And it's going to be about, as in these films, some people are worse than you are. They are below your scale. Great masses of troops. You can defeat them. They're below your scale. Some people are on your scale. And then it's a question of whether you can fight them and win or not. And that's where we get the real challenge roll. But then there are people that are above your scale, and you're going to lose. You're going to lose. As we've seen in these films and stories, the first time you fight these big bads, you lose. If you roll well, you get to say how you lose, and if you don't, it can end badly, and loved ones will be dead. And I was nervous about it because I'm so trad. I am so old and so trad, and I was like, oh, I don't know if this is going to work. And then the first time we did it, I said, okay, this is a fight. Tell me what's going on. Tell me how this looks. Got it set up, and we rolled, and it was satisfying. One roll, we see whether you win or lose. And I was so happy at that point.
Well, and it's not just winning and losing, right, Agatha? I mean, there's like a lot at stake in the rolls.
Yeah, I always like the time when you get to duel, because that's always where I'm like, okay, describe how awesome everything looks. So that's one thing that's always fun. This is where people can kind of regain the balance of, my character is always so emotionally vulnerable, but at least in combat they look really cool. Or they just get the fun of both. But oftentimes there's other consequences that come with the duels as well. Like, for example, like some of them you can have conditional wins where something else happens instead. And so there's a lot of different kinds of narrative outcomes depending on what your opponent's scale is and how you roll.
Yeah, it's really fun. I found it to be very elegant. The moves do a great job of like setting the stakes of like what is going to be happening and what does the fight mean? Like you said, Agatha, like it's okay, you win, but like in what way do you win? How do you win? Or do you win and do you show no mercy to the person who lost? Or do you win and have a moment of grace and let them go? Those little moments in the role play are really, really fun to explore. Again, with the combat, I found there to be this really terrific gameplay loop, right? And I think it's what you always kind of want in these games, right? You want these like loops that give you story arcs by just kind of like engaging with them. If you are facing off against an opponent who is higher scale, you automatically cannot win, like Lowell said. But then you have to consider, well, how can I beat them, right? Well, there's another move that lets you go learn a new technique, and that new technique leads to that. Usually pursuing that new technique usually leads to other kinds of like training montages or side quests or whatever in order to get the thing that you need to then be able to face the higher scale opponent, right? Like, it's just really great.
Yeah, and again about genre emulation, the training montage is literally written as a part of the move. So if you want to get good, you better describe a training montage for it.
It's really, really enjoyable. I did my Trial of Many Venoms, Tournament of Assassins framework the last time I ran it. That's a space where it's kind of all about the martial arts, right? Like there's the emotion, there's all the little side stories going on, but ultimately they're there to like compete in a tournament. And that creates a lot of space for, okay, I know I'm going to have to face this particular legendary warrior, at the end, and I can't do it. They're higher scale than me. So what do I do? And so we kind of interrupt the tournament to see this little training montage, and it just works so well, and it feels so good in play. Anything else you guys want to say about combat before we move on from combat? PC versus PC duels are pretty great, right?
I'm very happy with how those have resolved out.
Because it's a little different.
Yeah, I know, like in some other PBTA games, there's you do a move against a player, and then you get to help or hinder to kind of try and stop it and so on. And I think that's great, but I wanted something where the players have to kind of make a bargain. And it's a little bit like I cut, you pick from board games where, okay, I'll put these in 2 piles, and you get to pick what you want. In this case, the player who is challenging gets to say, if you let me win, then I'm going to give you these things. I'm going to give you narrative control. I'm going to change my entanglement for you. I'm going to mark damage. I'm going to have my weapon break. I'm going to have something occur, but I'll do that if you let me win. And the other player says yes or no. And if they say yes, then it rolls through. They get to mark XP, the player who was challenged. If they don't, both characters mark harm. And then the player who was challenged gets to decide whether they win or whether it's a draw. So you don't go into PvP lightly, because there are going to be consequences. It is a moment that asks us to kind of stop and slow down and kind of break the flow of the game a little, because it's so important. Because it is a moment when people who are really tightly tied together have to decide how they relate to one another. I don't know. What do you think, Agatha?
I've always really enjoyed it, especially when people offer narrative consequences to their wins. And yeah, there was one time when I ran it that the consequence that they offered was that the PC that they were challenging was in love with them. And then they said, okay, I'll change my entanglement so that I will be in love with you now if you let me win. And the other person was like, yeah, do it up.
Nice.
That's so awesome. There's 2 more things I want to talk about in terms of the mechanics and procedures and stuff of the game. The first is elements, which are what would be called like stats or abilities in other games. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the playbook choices and the roles within the playbooks and why that approach was taken. Let's talk about elements, though. My understanding of elements, having played quite a bit now, is they are elements inspired by classical notions of fire, wood, what are the other elements? Water,
metal.
There's 5, right? Yeah, metal.
Yeah.
Earth. It's based on the wuxing.
Okay, great.
The 5 elements.
Awesome. They are essentially like emotional states, and based off how you approach a particular problem in terms of your emotion, then you determine which element you're going to be rolling. For combat, you have a particular style element that you have to always use. This sounds like the Veil to me. Do I have it right?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Lowell?
It wouldn't be here without Fraser kind of showing me the way that this could go. I mean, that really, because I love the Veil. I think the Veil is dynamite and probably my favorite PBTA game. That idea combined with the sense of approaches that Fate takes, or Fate Accelerated specifically, when I finally brought those 2 together in my head, it made everything much easier. I wanted to make it open. I wanted to make it so that any task that you do, you could pick any of your elements, any of your stats to roll with, and that would shape what that looked like. There's a difference in if I'm using curiosity to roll to study versus if I'm using patience. There are different things that those represent versus if I'm using passion. I'm rushing in there to figure out what's going on.
Agatha, tell me a little bit more about the, say, wuxing? Is that what it was?
Wuxing, yeah. That's basically like the ancient Chinese idea of like the 5 elements that make up everything. And there's a lot of philosophical texts written about it. Right. This is just kind of like, I guess you could say it's kind of like the 4 humors, if you wanted a kind of comparison, except 4 humors is specifically about like what makes up a person, right? But then wuxing is wu is 5 and xing is ways or paths. So that's kind of how you think about it. But it's like everything can tie into ideas of wuxing in terms of the way the world is functioning. So even feng shui has aspects of that as well.
And I will say there are a couple of games Weapons of the Gods, and even Legend of the Five Rings that had elements as stats, but they were very fixed. You use this for this. Boom, you use this for this. And this kind of opened things up.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of it because the wuxing, again, it's an idea that is applied to so many different aspects of life that it is very flexible. So it's good that in this application, there's also flexible interpretations of them.
That's terrific. One of the things I thought was really interesting about the elements that I don't think I necessarily did a good job of presenting to my players, and I'm going to try to do better about it next time. But whenever the elements are marked, meaning you don't have access to them, you're supposed to role play in the opposite way. And the playbook lists like, okay, for fire, that's, for example, passionate. But if fire is marked, then maybe there's a sort of lethargy there or something, right? How has that been in your games, Lowell? Like, has that been coming through?
What I found is that when we get into the heat of the moment, those ideas, sometimes the player will grab onto them, but I make them really optional. If they're kind of uncertain how they should be reacting, they can go and look at that and figure out. And in the rules now, in the newest version, I mean, they're very much about color, fictional color, because between scenes you can kind of narrate a montage of how you're dealing with the issue and how you're clearing that marked stat. That's the place where those negative associations can be used to color how you go about doing that.
That's interesting. So let's talk about playbooks, because I think what you've both done here with the playbooks is really, really interesting. So there are a set of core playbooks like you might expect to find in any Powered by the Apocalypse game. But then within each playbook, there are 3 roles. And these roles help you more specifically define what kind of character you are. So for example, one of the playbooks is the outsider, but within the outsider framework, we have 3 different roles: the rebel, the trickster, and the wanderer. I'm curious, both from a sort of like, what are the mechanical implications of this structure, but also what are the genre implications of this structure?
Lowell and I were just discussing briefly what our favorite playbooks are. Of course, they're all precious babies, no favorite amongst them, so on and so forth. But we were both saying how we were very into the Loyal. And for me, it's partly because the first game that I played of it, I played a magistrate and I chose the Loyal and then the official as the background or the role. And there's aspects in the moves and the backgrounds associated with the Loyal that are about almost like a stereotypical idea of like a lot of these heroes in wuxia stories who are very bound by their loyalties hence the name Loyal, to whatever group they're the closest to or that they feel the most strong ties to. So it could be their family, it could be the emperor. So that's a thing. It could be to the imperial structure. Right. It could be to their faction. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of a convo about Confucianism, and the way that it's so deeply seeped into current Chinese social values. And of course, there's a lot of changes now in like the modern times, but a lot of like the social values about filial piety, just the expectation that you are going to be loyal to your parents and that you will listen to them and or the elders in your family. A lot of times that's like translated into English as the word duty, and I feel like duty does not fully encapsulate that idea because duty has a negative connotation to it. It feels like it's a burden. It's just something that you must do, which is true, and there's a lot of literature that kind of reflects on this idea as well and fights against the sort of conception of filial piety as a virtue. But at the same time, there's an acceptance and a willingness to uphold this loyalty that is really important to, I think, at least Chinese society, but also a lot of East Asian countries. So I feel like this playbook just encapsulates that willingness to be loyal really well. And in a way, it feels nice to me because I'm like, oh, I understand these values and they make sense to me.
This is really great. I feel like we just got a really terrific preview of the support text of the game, and I'm very excited to read it.
True.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. No, it's super cool. I mean, when I read these playbooks and the roles, obviously I'm not as steeped in either the genre or Chinese culture. But what I found was really fascinating about the role selections was I felt like I was getting genre, right? Like I don't even know the genre that well, but I read them and I thought, this is getting me pretty close to knowing what I need to do here. And I thought that was really great. Like, Lowell, what were some of the genre considerations as far as these choices go?
Well, originally I had thought about the sort of the major archetypes, and I had kind of looked at maybe, okay, well, when you advance, maybe when you move from student to loyal, and that there's a special move for your change there, and you evolve and things like that. I had this whole thing in my head. But once I got the archetypes down, I was like, okay, well, I need to have some examples so that people can get what I mean by outsider or get what I mean by loyal. And that evolved into those roles. Is I wanted to have 3 solid examples that were very different that would be within it. It's, the aware isn't just a scholar. I mean, the aware has the sifu and so on. And they use knowledge and scholarship and teaching in different ways. I think that gives a sense to the player of, oh, this is the space that I'm working in here.
That's super interesting. One thing I want to note about this setup, because I think it deserves to be said, I don't always love when Powered by the Apocalypse games do this. Like, I don't like it when you choose a base playbook and then you choose some occupation or some backstory that you like, and then you mix and match. Like, I don't usually love that. Like, I find it to be physically kind of annoying because you have multiple pieces of paper, or it can be incongruent thematically. You end up with these weird combinations. And what I think is really great about what you've done here with this game is it's all on one page. The role adds just a different move. There's like a single move that the role brings to it, but it's otherwise the role exists within the larger playbook structure. So you have this like basic coherency, and I don't know if that's making any sense to you both right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but that's how but it's nice. It's one of the best implementations of this kind of backstory or background choosing I've seen in a PBTA game.
I will say that one of the driving forces for all my design decisions is, how does this look at the table?
Yeah,
how do I
you can
make
tell.
This easier?
Yeah, it definitely feels like,
yeah.
Oh, this is like you just circle a thing and you're done, right? There's
yeah.
no like, I need a whole other piece of paper, or I need, yeah. So I really like that.
Yeah, I run a lot and I want to make it as streamlined as possible.
Agatha, is there anything else you want to add about playbooks?
Well, I did want to say, aside from my favorite quote-unquote playbook, I also have a favorite quote-unquote move. I don't know if we wanted to mention all of the playbooks, but another one, so the one that Lowell just mentioned briefly, the aware, that kind of like wise and or scholarly archetype. One of my favorite moves is from the aware, called the promise, which is when you attempt to keep someone from dying in your presence, you roll, and then
nice.
Depending on how you roll, they'll survive, but they may be in a coma for a dramatic appropriate amount of time, or you can keep them alive but then have to pay a cost, or on a miss, their death haunts you as an entanglement. So good.
That's so great. It's so melodrama. It's so soap opera, right? I love it. Like, I think it's so great.
I've seen that used very well in several games.
Yeah, it's such a good one.
Lowell, do you have any favorite playbooks or moves or anything?
I love the move where you can go and talk to a named agent of the big bad. It's not just, you can't just talk to the big bad, but you have to go talk to one of their lieutenants. You can try and change their loyalty. And I love that because that's so in genre, where you make them hesitate and they're thinking about, all the bad things that have gone on. And sometimes they'll come and help you, and sometimes they'll run off and get themselves killed. But I love that one.
It's terrific.
I also have to call out, just one more thing, is originally there were just 5 playbooks, and it was my wife, Sherry, who was like, I want a character that doesn't know martial arts, but kind of does know martial arts. And that's where we came up with the unorthodox, with the accidental. And then that allowed me to find a place for the character who has to hide themselves, which comes from a lot of these movies. And then the character that is my sort of take on Avatar Last Airbender, where you kind of don't have control of your powers. And there's a little bit of that. The unorthodox is the playbook that can get a little bit silly or at least can move it into comedic stuff, so the GM has to kind of look at it there. But I adore that one.
Yeah, I think it's also one of the players' favorite playbooks to choose from.
Okay, before we start talking about the Kickstarter, I want to just ask if either of you have anything else you want to talk about or mention before we leave rules and mechanics.
Me.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I wanted to add one more thing about entanglements that I love. And, okay, everyone, buckle in your seatbelts for another tiny bit of cultural context that I love about the entanglements. So I actually only discovered this when I was chatting about it with Daniel on Agents Represent, and I was kind of verbally processing, which is how I usually do. And there's one aspect of the entanglements that I love, and I think, Jason, you mentioned briefly that the mechanics of this game do really help set people up for understanding at least the tone of the game and then how it's going to play. But I realized that the entanglements are actually really great for helping people understand a little bit of like the cultural values that inform this genre. So I have the entanglements in front of me, and I'll give an example. I'll look at the romantic one. So an example is, I love so-and-so, but my teacher so-and-so killed someone dear to them. And in this case, it's putting the person that you love romantically on the same level of importance as your teacher, which is, I think, very different. And nowadays, it's also not the same in China. Like, that's people don't treat teachers the same way anymore, unfortunately. But like in this historical context, like teachers, there's a saying that's like, if you are a teacher for one day, then you are father for life. Basically, this kind of respect for authority means that both of these people are super important to the PC that chose this. And Lowell, you talked about this on Zhang Hustle in a way that I thought was very cool. And it was a contrasting about how these values, or the way that people would treat this kind of tension in a relationship differently in like an Eastern context, a more collectivist society versus like in the West, a more individualist society. Do you remember what you...
I don't remember exactly what I said, but it is that thing where I think in a Western game, players might regard that relationship with their teacher as adversarial, which it's not. It is about that you are torn because they matter equally.
Yeah.
And the decision is not easy.
It's less so about like, oh, if they don't find out, then it's fine. I'll just continue doing this. And my conscience feels okay with it. But instead, it's that even your conscience would be bothered by the fact that you are going against the wishes of, well, in this case, it's that your teacher killed someone dear to the person you love. And so that is about the matters of the heart that is baked into this game. Because if you choose one of these entanglements, or one of those like, I love so-and-so, but their family member is a villain, it's that you care immediately about both of these things, and your PC does, and should treat them with the same amount of weight. And I love that about these entanglements, where it's subtly kind of informing people about the cultural values of this world as well.
That's so awesome. I would have never picked up on that myself, but now that you bring it up, it actually makes a huge amount of sense. I can only speak in an American context, but like in America, we don't value things like teachers. We very infrequently value community because we're so caught up in our sort of individual desires. That's a really interesting note about the entanglements. It actually really enriches the idea of the entanglements. I think that's great. Lowell, is there anything else you want to say before we head on to Kickstarter?
I've talked about the study move and the ability to, when you roll study, you either get to ask a question or make a statement. In a way, they're exactly the same thing. They do exactly the same function. But what the study move is saying is, oh, you get to make this declaration, you roll, and you get some hold, and you can spend that hold to declare that somebody has a different loyalty, or, you know, somebody has this secret training, whatever. If as a player, you don't want that narrative weight, you're not comfortable with it, or maybe you haven't thought of anything, you have those questions. You get to throw that to the GM. And that was something that Sherry taught me, was that moves that require a player to do something need to have on the spot, should have a safety valve for players to be able to go, no, GM, tell me what's going on.
And just to be perfectly clear, this study move, it's similar to, say, discern realities or something like that.
Pierce the mask, all of those.
But what this does, it's I thought was really interesting is it explicitly allows the players to add to the fiction, right, to create a truth.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is, but it also has this safety valve of the player doesn't have to, right? Like you can rely on the GM. I think that's good game design. Yeah.
I think that what's interesting is when you first look at the study move, you're like, oh, this is the question move. But the study move is actually, this is the move where I get to change the drama. I get to change the story. And if you don't want to do that, you can just ask a question.
Yeah, it's a great compromise. My frame of reference, or I should say the game I have the most experience with is probably, outside of Monster Hearts, probably Dungeon World. And in Dungeon World, many people play Dungeon World the way they do discern realities and spout lore the way your study move is, even though that's not in the rules.
Yeah.
Like the rules of Dungeon World explicitly do not let the player create that fiction. And I think it's nice that you have the option in there. But Sherry's observation is really astute. A lot of players don't want to do that, or they don't feel they don't really cope with the sort of on the spot pressure of having to do that, right? And
or
so
they're
it's
just
nice.
curious about what the GM came
That's
up
true
with.
too. Yeah, that's
you know?
absolutely true. Yeah.
They want to know what the story is that they're not seeing.
Let's talk about Kickstarter. Listeners probably already know this, but Hearts of Wulin is being published by the Gauntlet. It's our first standalone game project, and we're really excited about it. And my role in that is to develop the marketing of it. And a big part of that marketing plan is the Kickstarter campaign, which will be launching in a few days. I think we're targeting, I want to say May 7th is the date we're looking at.
Right.
And I just want to throw out so that listeners understand what's going to be available on the Kickstarter. And then I'm going to ask both of you about, maybe it's not totally confirmed yet, but maybe some hopes and dreams for stretch goals. I think that might be fun to talk about. Listeners, in the Kickstarter, you will be able to back at levels that get you can get Hearts of Wulin, the core book, digitally with all of the digital stretch goals that are unlocked during the campaign. You will have the option of getting a softcover book, and you'll have the option of getting a hardcover book. Many Kickstarters do not give you the hardcover option right away, or they require the campaign to hit a certain dollar amount before they can make hardcover available. But we're very fortunate that we have the financial wherewithal to make hardcover available immediately. So you'll have the choice. We're also going to have hardcovers that are signed by Agatha and Lowell. There will be a limited number of those available. And then we're also going to have, much like we did with the Codex Kickstarter, we're going to have pledge tiers where different members of the Gauntlet community, including Agatha and Lowell, will run sessions of Hearts of Wulin for you in addition to getting your copy of the book. So those are the basic pledge tiers that folks can look forward to. I want to talk about stretch goal ideas. One stretch goal is we have this really, really beautiful art by Minerva Fox. And if you follow us on Twitter, you've seen us posting that stuff all over the place. I'm excited about the stretch goal that lets us make the interior of the book entirely color. Right now it's set for black and white, but if we can hit the color stretch goal, I think it's going to be really, really, it's just going to take the book to a whole other level of like beauty and presentation. But what about some of the substantive stretch goals? Like what are we kind of hoping for here? None of this is confirmed, but just, what's your dream stretch goal?
Agatha?
One stretch goal that it is definitely a huge dream is I want a different setting for this game where it can be based on I'm thinking specifically like a Korean drama kind of setting, because I feel like a lot of these mechanics are really adaptable to a lot of genres that have high melodrama, but specifically because I grew up watching Jumong, which is one of those epic historical stories about this Korean king. And I would just love for this to be adapted. That'd be so cool.
Possibility, listeners, possibility. Lowell, what's your dream stretch goal?
I have a bunch of them, but the one that I really want is I want a version of this, an adaptation of this, to do a school dueling game a la Revolutionary Girl Utna, which is a slightly more obscure anime series that I adore.
Wait, Lowell, can you say that again? Did you say Revolutionary Girl what?
Utna?
That's so horrible.
Am I saying that terribly wrong? How am I saying it?
Well, you're saying it with your accent, which is
With my Hoosier accent here.
Aww,
Say it for me. Say it for me, Agatha.
Well, I don't know. I'm not Japanese.
Okay. You're just calling me out. Anyway, it's one of my favorite. It was a manga. It was an anime series. It has a very weird movie. And it's about a strange school that this heroine goes to. And there's all this weird stuff going on. And there are these duels being fought in the background with the student council. And I want something like that. That's what I want.
Awesome. I'll tell you that my sort of like, I don't know if they're dream stretch goals necessarily, because I think we are going to get some of them for sure, but I'm really interested in some short campaign frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's going to be, you published that Age of Ravens blog post about, I think it was called 18 Wulin starters, right? That had like these like sort of short story prompts to like get your game going. And I took one of those and the Assassin's Tournament one, and I was able to kind of spin that out into like a really nice framework that my game of Hearts of Wulin existed in, and I would love to see some of those too. I think that would be great. Like, but I always love stuff like that. I love like starters and scenarios and things like that. So, well, listeners, Kickstarter is coming, so we definitely want you to go take a look at that. And if everything you've heard here today sounds amazing, please go consider backing the campaign when it goes live. Before we leave, I just want to express to both of you, this project sounds, it doesn't sound, I know it's amazing, I've played it, but it's super special to me because I have grown so close to both of you over the last, Lowell over the last few years and Agatha over the last year or so. And I just love both of your contributions to the Gauntlet community. I've enjoyed seeing how, I'm getting emotional now. I've enjoyed seeing both of the way you both interact with the Gauntlet community, but also like with the greater role-playing game community. Like Agatha, like, going on from, being a member of our community and playing games, and then putting together the fabulous Asians Represent podcast, like just that, that kind of seeing your career, so to speak, in role-playing games. And now we have this, Hearts of Wulin that's happening. I feel like so personally connected to it and to both of you. And I think because of what you both do for the role-playing game community, both as people and what you do for, because you're not just game designers and authors, not that that's not a great thing, but you are community people, right? Like Agatha, you are trying to improve the landscape of representation in games with Asians Represent. And Lowell, you are the architect of so much of the Gauntlet, which is this amazing space that people can go and enjoy and play and everything. And so I'm just happy that we're here. I'm really happy that we're here in this space and that we're able to help you guys bring this book to life. And listeners, I hope you will also just keep that in mind as you're thinking about whether you want to support it or not. So I think that's all I've got. Thank you both so much for coming on and talking with me about Hearts of Wulin.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.
And listeners, we'll have notes about where to find more information about the game, including the public playtest materials, and we will update the show notes with the Kickstarter campaign when it goes live. And that's all I've got. Take care.